So when I think about what you're going through now in terms of a Senate race, and I think about the country as a whole, the thing that separates the United States from other countries is our free and fair elections, right? That is really the differentiator between us and every other country across the globe. Voter suppression, Congressman, is a huge problem for the minority community. Mm-hmm. And it feels like those in the White House are trying everything in their control to increase voter suppression for the minority community. If elected to Senate, what would you and your fellow congressmen and women do to relieve that pressure of voter suppression on the minority community?
So Karim, I think you're 100% right, but let me just add on another piece here that I think probably goes without saying, but so forgive me. You're seeing this in the midst of a global and nationwide pandemic that this administration did not solve, right? But knowing that, and knowing obviously the infection rates and mortality rates and how those vary demographically, particularly for Black and brown, and particularly actually for Black men, these aspects of voter suppression, particularly when it comes to vote by mail or early vote, become all the more potent. Because you essentially, by not allowing those options, it's massive voter suppression because you're forcing people to choose between literally taking, perhaps given other infection rates in parts of the country, infection from COVID-19 or their voice or their vote, right? And you add on top of that then efforts to delay or sabotage the postal service. You add on top of that closure of polling locations, rolling back of the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, and all of a sudden that becomes even more egregious. And so what would we do? Look, I think this comes down to two pieces in my mind, one process and one substantive. One, you work and do everything you can now to ensure that there is a Democratic White House, Senate, and presidency. And that's critical, not just because I can say, look, yeah, I want to, overhaul and protect the Voting Rights Act, pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and undo the consequences of Shelby v. Alabama, and political gerrymandering and the impact of campaign finance reform and all of these other bills that we've actually already passed out of the House, but aren't going anywhere in the Senate because of the structural blockage in the Senate. And so what do you need to do? One is end the filibuster. And two is then pass that package of reforms, the democracy reforms that we call our first bill out of the House, H.R. 1, to enable a democracy to be more responsive to its people. You're not going to do that just by signing on to that bill. You have to go out there and force that issue and push for that change around the country. And that's what I hope to do if we've got the time, if I'm successful on Tuesday.
Why do you think those in the Senate on the other side of the aisle have been so resistant to something as fundamental as open voting and free voting for minorities and for everyone across the country?
Karim, I think the underlying motivation there is their own protection of what they view as their communities and their way of life, right? And they're able to justify that in certain ways by saying, well, yes, everybody should get access to right to vote, but you have to have an ID because we're going to clamp down on fraud. Well, what kind of ID do you need? Well, a firearms ID counts, but a student ID doesn't. Well, what about in communities where a lot of folks don't have ID? Well, they should be able to get one. Well, what about polling locations? Well, it turns out we can close a whole bunch of them, right? And that's not, we can do that because of budgetary issues, not because we're trying to actually impact the ability of people to vote. And so what you have is Republicans that look at this, look at the expansion of the franchise and the increasing political voice that comes with it, and sees literally a threat to the artificial station that they enjoy, right? It's literally the definition of white privilege and white supremacy codified in our laws, right? Like, that's what it is. And so what are they doing? They're fighting to maintain that with everything they've got. And what is our job? To fight to deconstruct that with everything we've got, because that's the promise of this country, literally, again, in the beginning words of our founding documents.